The morning sun painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the covered wagon, her long brown hair catching the early light. She had been traveling with the wagon train for 3 weeks now, heading west toward California with her younger brother Tommy and their elderly uncle who had promised them a new life after their parents died of fever back in Missouri. The other families in their group had been kind enough, sharing meals and stories around the campfire each evening, but Sarah always felt the weight of curious stares, especially from the men who seemed to think a 19-year-old girl traveling without proper family protection was somehow available for their attention. She kept her distance, focusing instead on caring for 8-year-old Tommy and helping their uncle manage their supplies. On this particular morning, something felt different. The usual chatter among the travelers was subdued, and the wagon master, a grizzled man named Jeremiah Hayes, kept scanning the horizon with worried eyes. Sarah noticed how he checked his rifle more frequently than usual and spoke in hushed tones with the other men. "What's got everyone so nervous?" Sarah asked Mrs. Peterson, a kindly woman who had taken Sarah under her wing during the journey. "Apache territory," Mrs. Peterson whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "We've been seeing signs for the past 2 days. Jeremiah thinks we're being watched." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had heard terrible stories about Apache raids, though she had also heard they were often exaggerated to frighten people. Still, the fear in Mrs. Peterson's eyes was real enough. As the wagon train continued its slow progress across the desert floor, Sarah found herself looking over her shoulder more often. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, with towering red rocks and sparse vegetation that offered little comfort to travelers. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Every sound made her heart skip. Around midday, they stopped near a small creek to water the animals and refill their containers. Sarah was helping Tommy splash his face with the cool water when she noticed a movement on a ridge about a quarter-mile away. For just a moment, she saw the silhouette of a man on horseback, perfectly still against the bright sky. When she blinked and looked again, he was gone. "Did you see that?" she asked Tommy, pointing toward the ridge. Her brother squinted in the direction she indicated. "See what?" Before Sarah could answer, a shout rang out from the other side of the camp. One of the scouts had returned at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. "Apache war party," he yelled as he rode into camp. "Maybe 15-20 warriors. They're moving parallel to us, staying just out of rifle range." The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Jeremiah Hayes barked orders while men grabbed their weapons and women gathered their children. Sarah felt her uncle's weathered hand on her shoulder. "Stay close to the wagon," he told her, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Keep Tommy with you no matter what happens." As the afternoon wore on, the tension became almost unbearable. The Apache warriors remained visible on the distant ridges, sometimes appearing as dark figures against the sky, sometimes vanishing completely. They seemed to be studying the wagon train, learning its strengths and weaknesses. Sarah tried to keep Tommy distracted with stories and games, but she could see the fear growing in his young eyes. The other children in the train had picked up on their parents' anxiety, and several were crying despite their mother's attempts to comfort them. When evening came, Jeremiah decided they would make camp in a defensive circle, with the wagons forming a barrier and the livestock kept in the center. No fires would be lit that night, and guards would be posted in shifts. Everyone would sleep with their weapons close at hand. As darkness fell over the desert, Sarah lay in the wagon bed next to Tommy, listening to every sound. The desert night was full of mysterious noises: the howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the occasional snort from one of the horses. But underneath it all, she sensed something else, a watching presence that made her skin crawl. Around midnight, she heard it. The soft sound of movement outside the wagon circle. Not the random wandering of desert animals, but something deliberate and careful. She carefully lifted the canvas covering and peered out into the moonlit landscape. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the silvery light, she began to make out shapes moving in the shadows. The Apache warriors had crept much closer than anyone realized. They were positioned all around the camp, silent as ghosts. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure it could be heard throughout the camp. She gently shook her uncle awake and whispered what she had seen. He immediately woke the nearest guard, and within minutes the alarm was being passed quietly from wagon to wagon. But it was too late. The attack came just before dawn, when the defenders were tired and the light was dim enough to provide cover for the raiders. War cries split the morning air as Apache warriors swept down from all sides, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. Sarah grabbed Tommy and pulled him down into the bottom of the wagon as bullets and arrows flew overhead. The sound was deafening. Men shouting, women screaming, horses neighing in terror, and the constant crack of rifle fire. Through a gap in the wagon's canvas, Sarah could see the battle raging around them. The Apache warriors rode their horses with incredible skill, hanging off one side to avoid bullets while firing arrows with deadly accuracy. Several of the defenders had already fallen, and it was clear the wagon train was badly outnumbered. "Sarah," her uncle called out, "take Tommy and run for those rocks." He pointed toward a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards from the camp. "Hide there until it's over." Sarah looked into her uncle's eyes and saw something that terrified her more than the battle itself. He was saying goodbye. He knew he wasn't going to survive this fight, and he was trying to give her and Tommy a chance. "I can't leave you," she protested. "You have to," he insisted, pressing his old hunting rifle into her hands. "Promise me you'll take care of the boy." Before Sarah could argue further, a flaming arrow struck their wagon's canvas cover. In seconds, the entire wagon was ablaze. With no choice left, Sarah grabbed Tommy's hand and leaped from the burning wagon into the chaos of the battle. Sarah ran through the chaos with Tommy's small hand clutched tightly in hers, dodging between burning wagons and fallen bodies. The smoke from the fires made it hard to see, and the acrid smell burned her throat. Bullets whined past them as they zigzagged toward the rocks her uncle had pointed out. Halfway to safety, Tommy stumbled and fell hard, scraping his knee on the rocky ground. Sarah turned back to help him, but as she did, she saw 3 Apache warriors bearing down on them, their painted faces fierce in the morning light. She raised her uncle's rifle, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. The lead warrior, a tall man with broad shoulders and long black hair decorated with feathers, reined in his horse just yards away from them. His dark eyes met Sarah's, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, neither of them moved. There was something in his gaze that wasn't quite what she had expected. Not the savage bloodlust the stories had described, but something more complex. Behind them, the battle was winding down. Most of the wagon train's defenders were dead or wounded, and the survivors were being rounded up by the Apache warriors. Sarah could hear Mrs. Peterson crying and calling for her husband, who lay motionless near their overturned wagon. The warrior in front of Sarah spoke a few words in his native language to his companions, never taking his eyes off her face. One of the other warriors replied with what sounded like an argument, but the leader held up his hand for silence. His authority was clear. The others might disagree with whatever he was planning, but they would follow his orders. "Don't let them take me," Sarah whispered, pulling Tommy closer to her side. She wasn't sure if she was praying or just speaking her fear aloud, but the words seemed to hang in the air between her and the Apache leader. The warrior dismounted from his horse with fluid grace and walked slowly toward them. Sarah raised the rifle again, but her arms were trembling with exhaustion and terror. She had never shot at another human being before, and even now, facing capture or death, she wasn't sure she could pull the trigger. When the warrior was close enough to touch the rifle's barrel, he spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "Put down gun. No hurt, boy." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected him to speak her language at all, let alone with such careful consideration for Tommy's safety. Still, she kept the rifle pointed at his chest. "What do you want with us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The warrior studied her face for a long moment before answering. "You come with us. Boy too, safe." "Safe?" Sarah almost laughed despite her terror. "You just killed everyone we know. How is that safe?" Something flickered across the warrior's features. Was it regret? Or not choice? "Your people take Apache land, Apache children. This is answer." Behind him, the other 2 warriors were growing impatient. One of them, a younger man with a scar across his left cheek, said something sharp in Apache. The leader turned and replied with obvious authority, his tone making it clear this was not open for discussion. Sarah realized that whatever was happening here, it was unusual. The leader was making decisions that his own men didn't fully understand or agree with. She sensed that this moment balanced on the edge of a knife, that her response could determine whether she and Tommy lived or died. "If we come with you," she said carefully. You promise the boy won't be harmed? The warrior nodded solemnly. Word of Ayana. Boy will be safe. You will be safe, Ayana. Is that your name? Name White Tongue cannot say proper. You call Ayana. Sarah looked down at Tommy, who was staring up at the Apache warrior with wide, frightened eyes. The little boy had been through so much already, losing their parents, the difficult journey west, and now this massacre. She couldn't bear the thought of him suffering anymore. Slowly, she lowered the rifle. All right. We'll come with you. But if you hurt him... She let the threat hang unfinished. Ayana nodded with what might have been respect. He called out to one of his warriors, who brought over 2 horses. These weren't the wild Mustangs Sarah had imagined Apache raiders would ride, but well-trained animals with decorated bridles and saddle blankets. You ride? Ayana asked. Sarah nodded. She had learned to ride as a child back in Missouri, though it had been months since she had been on horseback. Tommy had ridden a few times, but he would need help. As Ayana helped them mount the horses, Sarah caught sight of the wagon train's remains. The fires were dying down now, leaving blackened skeletons of wood and metal scattered across the desert floor. Bodies lay where they had fallen, and she could see that very few of the travelers had survived. Mrs. Peterson was among a small group of prisoners being guarded by Apache warriors near the creek. What will happen to them? Sarah asked, nodding toward the other survivors. Ayana followed her gaze. Depends. Old woman, maybe trade back to white settlements, others. He shrugged. Decide later. Sarah's stomach turned. She understood that she and Tommy were receiving special treatment for reasons she didn't fully comprehend. The other survivors might not be so fortunate. As they prepared to leave, Ayana mounted his own horse and rode close to Sarah's side. You afraid? He observed. It wasn't a question. Of course I'm afraid, Sarah replied honestly. Wouldn't you be? For the first time, something that might have been a smile crossed Ayana's features. Yes, fear makes sense. But you brave too. Not many white women stand with rifle against Apache warrior. I was protecting my brother. Yes, this is why you live. As the war party began to move away from the destroyed wagon train, Sarah turned back for one last look at the only life she had known for the past 3 weeks. Everything she and Tommy owned was now ash and smoke. Their uncle was dead, along with most of the people who had shared their journey. They were now completely at the mercy of these Apache warriors, heading into an unknown future in a harsh and unfamiliar land. Tommy rode beside her on his horse, his small hands gripping the reins tightly. He hadn't spoken since they had been captured, but Sarah could see he was trying to be brave. She reached over and touched his arm gently. It's going to be all right, she told him, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Ayana, riding on her other side, heard her words. Yes, he said quietly, so that only she could hear. We'll be all right. This is promise. They rode through the desert for hours under the blazing sun, following paths that seemed invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes. The Apache warriors moved with practiced efficiency, their horses picking their way carefully across rocky terrain that would have been impossible for the heavy wagons of the wagon train to navigate. Sarah's body ached from the unfamiliar riding position, and she could see that Tommy was struggling even more. Several times she noticed him swaying in his saddle, exhausted from the heat and trauma of the morning's events. Each time, Ayana would call a brief halt, allowing them to drink water from leather containers and rest in whatever shade they could find. During one of these stops, Sarah found herself studying her captors more carefully. They weren't the savage raiders she had been taught to expect. Their weapons and clothing showed skilled craftsmanship, and they moved with a discipline that spoke of organized military thinking rather than random violence. Most importantly, they treated Tommy with gentle consideration, helping him down from his horse and making sure he drank enough water. The warrior with the scar, who Sarah had learned was called Nalnish, seemed less pleased with their presence than the others. He frequently spoke to Ayana in rapid Apache, his tone suggesting disagreement or concern. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she sensed that bringing 2 white captives back to their camp was creating some kind of problem. He doesn't like us being here, Sarah said to Ayana during one of their rest stops. Ayana glanced toward Nalnish, who was watering the horses at a small spring they had found. Nalnish think white prisoners bring trouble. Maybe he right. Then why did you take us? Ayana was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, 3 moons ago, white soldiers take my sister. She have same eyes as you, same brave heart. Maybe she still live, maybe not. But when I see you stand with gun to protect boy," he shrugged. "Apache believe all things connected. Maybe spirits send you to replace what was taken." Sarah felt a chill despite the desert heat. She was beginning to understand that she and Tommy weren't just random captives. They represented something specific to Ayanna, something personal and important. This knowledge was both reassuring and terrifying. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills covered with scrub oak and juniper trees. In the distance, Sarah could see mountains rising like purple shadows against the sky. The air grew cooler and carried the scent of pine. Tommy had been quiet all day, but now he seemed to be reviving slightly in the more pleasant environment. "Sarah," he whispered, riding close beside her, "where are they taking us?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but we're going to be all right. I promise." Even as she said the words, Sarah wondered if she was lying to her little brother. What did she really know about their situation? She was basing her optimism largely on Ayanna's behavior, but he was still an Apache warrior who had participated in the massacre of their wagon train. How could she trust him? As if reading her thoughts, Ayanna rode up beside them. "Soon reach winter camp," he told them. "My people there since first snow. Women will care for you, give you food and place to sleep." "What happens after that?" Sarah asked. "Depend on many things. Council must decide what to do with white prisoners. But you under my protection now. This means something to Apache." They crested a hill just as the sun was beginning to set, and Sarah saw their destination spread out in the valley below. The Apache camp was larger than she had expected, with dozens of traditional dwellings arranged in a rough circle around a central area where several fires burned. People moved about their evening tasks, women preparing food, men tending horses, children playing games in the gathering twilight. As the war party descended into the valley, curious faces turned toward them. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes studying her and Tommy, and she heard the murmur of voices discussing their arrival. Some of the expressions were curious, others hostile, and a few seemed merely indifferent. An older woman with gray hair braided with silver ornaments approached them as they dismounted near the edge of the camp. She spoke rapidly to Ayanna, her tone sharp with questions. Sarah caught the word for white in her speech and understood that she was asking about the prisoners. Ayanna's response was calm but firm. The old woman looked skeptical, but she nodded and gestured toward one of the dwellings. Sarah realized this must be where she and Tommy would be staying. "Grandmother will care for you," Ayanna explained. "She not happy about white prisoners, but she follow my word. You safe with her." The dwelling they were led to was simple but comfortable, with sleeping mats arranged around a small fire pit. The walls were made of carefully woven branches and animal hides, and the floor was covered with soft rugs. It was warmer and more inviting than Sarah had expected. The grandmother, who Ayanna introduced as Desba, brought them food without speaking, a stew made with meat and vegetables that Sarah didn't recognize, along with a kind of flatbread that was surprisingly good. Tommy ate hungrily, the first time he had shown real appetite since the morning's attack. After they had eaten, Desba brought them clean clothing, simple tunics and leggings made from soft deerskin. She indicated with gestures that they should change, and pointed to a small alcove where they could have privacy. When Sarah emerged wearing the Apache clothing, she caught Ayanna watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The clothes fit well and were more comfortable than her travel-stained dress had been. But wearing them felt like crossing some invisible line, taking a step away from her old life and toward something unknown. "You look like Apache woman now," Ayanna said quietly. "But I'm not," Sarah replied. "I'm still just Sarah Mitchell from Missouri." Maybe. Or maybe Sarah Mitchell from Missouri died this morning with wagon train. Maybe now you someone new. That night, lying on the sleeping mat next to Tommy, Sarah stared up through the smoke hole in the roof at the stars overhead. The same stars she had watched from her family's farm back in Missouri. The same ones she had seen from the wagon train. But everything else in her world had changed completely. Tommy had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but Sarah's mind was racing. What did these people really want with them? How long would they be prisoners here? And what had Ayanna meant about her becoming someone new? Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling down for the night. Quiet conversations, the crackling of dying fires, the soft sounds of horses moving in their enclosures. It was peaceful in a way that surprised her. These people who had seemed so terrifying just hours ago were simply living their lives, caring for their families, preparing for another day. As sleep finally began to claim her, Sarah thought about Ayana's sister, the one taken by white soldiers 3 months ago. Somewhere out there, another young woman was probably lying awake in an unfamiliar place, wondering what would happen to her next. The realization that she and that unknown Apache girl were both victims of the same cycle of violence and revenge was her last conscious thought before exhaustion finally overcame her. Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside their dwelling, speaking in low but urgent tones. The morning light filtering through the smoke hole told her it was still early, and Tommy was still sleeping peacefully beside her. She lay still, trying to understand what was happening. Through the wall, she could hear Ayana's voice, along with several others she didn't recognize. The conversation was entirely in Apache, but the tone suggested disagreement or concern. After several minutes, the voices moved away, leaving the camp quiet except for the normal sounds of people beginning their daily tasks. Desba appeared at the entrance to their dwelling, carrying a wooden bowl of water and what looked like soap made from plant roots. She gestured for Sarah to wash, then brought clean clothes, another deerskin tunic, but this one decorated with small beads and colorful thread. The old woman's manner was still distant but not unfriendly. When Tommy woke up, Desba brought him similar items, along with a gentle smile that was the first real warmth Sarah had seen from her. It seemed the grandmother had a soft spot for children, regardless of their origin. After they had washed and dressed, Desba led them outside for their morning meal. The camp was fully awake now, with women tending cooking fires, men checking their weapons and horses, and children running between the dwellings at play. Sarah noticed that many people stopped their activities to stare as she and Tommy passed by. They were given places around one of the cooking fires, where several Apache women were preparing food for their families. Sarah watched carefully, trying to learn their customs and avoid giving offense. The women didn't speak to her directly, but she caught them exchanging glances and occasional whispered comments. The food was simple but nourishing, a porridge made from ground acorns mixed with berries, along with strips of dried meat. Tommy ate without complaint, though Sarah could see he was still subdued by their circumstances. Ayana appeared as they were finishing their meal. He looked tired, as if he had been awake for hours dealing with problems. "Council want to speak with you," he told Sarah quietly. "They decide what happened next." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What kind of council?" "Apache way. Elder men and women who make decisions for tribe. They want to know why I bring white prisoners to camp, what to do with you now. And Tommy? Boy, stay with Desba for now. Council only want to speak with you." Sarah looked at her little brother, who was listening to every word despite pretending to focus on his food. The thought of leaving him even temporarily made her heart race with anxiety. "He'll be safe," Ayana assured her, seeming to understand her concern. "Desba protect him with her life if needed." Is Apache way with children? The council meeting was held in the largest dwelling in the camp, where a circle of older Apache men and women waited in dignified silence. Sarah recognized the authority. In their bearing immediately, these were people accustomed to making life and death decisions for their community. Ayana led her to a place in the center of the circle and then took his own position among the council members. An elderly man with white hair and deeply lined features seemed to be the leader. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and wisdom. Ayana translated for Sarah as the discussion proceeded. "He asked why you here. I tell about wagon train attack, about how you stand brave to protect boy. He want to know if this true." Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the elderly leader. "Yes, it's true. Tommy is my brother. I would do anything to protect him." The old man nodded as Ayana translated her words. Another council member, a stern-faced woman with intricate tattoos on her arms, spoke next. Her tone was sharp with questions. "She asked if you hate Apache for attack on wagon train. She want to know if you plan revenge if we let you live." Sarah considered her answer carefully. These people would respect honesty more than flattery or false promises. "I don't understand why the attack happened," she said finally. "It was terrible and people died who didn't deserve to die. But I also know that your people have suffered losses too. Ayana told me soldiers took his sister. Maybe we're all just trying to protect the people we love." This answer seemed to surprise some of the council members. There was a lengthy discussion in Apache before the leader spoke again. He say this is wisdom unusual in white woman. Most of your people see only their own pain, not pain of others. But still you are white, and some think you bring danger to camp. A younger council member spoke up, his voice harsh with anger. Sarah could understand enough of his tone to know he was arguing against her continued presence in the camp. Ayana's response was firm and carried obvious authority. The discussion continued for several minutes, sometimes heated, sometimes thoughtful. Sarah waited, trying to remain calm despite not understanding most of what was being said about her fate. Finally, the elderly leader raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his words were measured and formal. Council decide, Ayana translated. You can stay in camp through winter. When spring come, we decide what happened next. Maybe trade you back to white settlements, maybe you choose to stay with Apache. But for now, you under protection of tribe. Sarah felt relief wash over her, followed immediately by new concerns. What does that mean exactly? What will be expected of me? You live as Apache woman, learn our ways, work alongside other women, help with tasks of camp. If you prove yourself useful and trustworthy, maybe council let you stay longer. After the formal council meeting ended, several of the members approached Sarah individually. The tattooed woman whom Ayana introduced as Nahazan seemed particularly interested in her. She wants to know if you have skills, Ayana explained as the older woman examined Sarah's hands and spoke rapidly. Can you sew, work with hides, prepare food, make medicine from plants? Some of those things, Sarah admitted. I can sew and cook. I don't know much about working with hides or making medicine, but I'm willing to learn. Nahazan nodded approvingly and spoke to Ayana. She say you will work with women of camp. They teach you Apache ways, you teach them white woman ways. Maybe both sides learn something useful. As they walked back through the camp, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere seemed different somehow. Word of the council's decision had apparently spread quickly, and people no longer stared at her with the same suspicion. Some even nodded politely as she passed. What changed? She asked Ayana. Council approve you staying. This mean you not just prisoner now, you guest of tribe. People treat you different. When they reached Desba's dwelling, they found Tommy helping the old woman grind acorns into flour. He looked up hopefully as Sarah approached. Are we staying? He asked quietly. For now, Sarah told him. Through the winter, at least. We're going to learn Apache ways and try to be helpful to the people here. Tommy nodded seriously. Despite his youth, he seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Grandmother taught me some Apache words, he said proudly, and she showed me how to make the flour smooth. Desba smiled at the boy's enthusiasm and spoke to Ayana. She say boy learn fast, have good hands for work. Maybe he make good Apache warrior someday. Sarah's breath caught. The casual mention of Tommy potentially becoming an Apache warrior brought home the reality of their situation. They weren't just temporary guests here. There was a real possibility that this could become their permanent home, that they could be transformed from white settlers into members of an Apache tribe. That evening, as the camp settled down for the night, Sarah sat outside Desba's dwelling and watched the stars emerge one by one in the clear desert sky. Everything about her life had changed in less than 2 days, and she still didn't know what the future held. But for the first time since the wagon train attack, she felt something that might have been hope. Winter settled over the Apache camp like a heavy blanket, bringing cold nights and shorter days. Sarah had been living with the tribe for almost 2 months now, and the rhythm of Apache life had become surprisingly familiar. She woke each morning to help Desba prepare the day's meals, spent her afternoons working with the other women on various tasks, and fell asleep each night to the sound of voices telling stories around the fires. Tommy had adapted even more quickly than she had. The 8-year-old boy who had been so frightened and quiet during their first days in camp was now running and laughing with the Apache children, speaking their language with the easy fluency that came naturally to the young. Sometimes Sarah would catch sight of him playing with the other boys and have to look twice to recognize her own brother among them. He forget white world fast. Desba observed one morning as they watched Tommy practice shooting arrows with a small bow one of the men had made for him. The old woman spoke more English now than when Sarah had first arrived, the result of their daily interactions. Is that good or bad? Sarah asked. Desba shrugged. Is survival. Boy who cannot change, cannot live. Apache way hard for those who stay rigid. Sarah understood what she meant. The Apache way of life required constant adaptation to changing circumstances, following game migrations, avoiding enemy raids, finding water in a harsh landscape. People who couldn't bend with these changes didn't last long. Her own transformation had been more gradual but no less significant. Her hands, once soft from domestic work, were now calloused from preparing hides and gathering firewood. She could identify edible plants, track small game, and navigate by the stars. Most surprisingly, she had discovered she had a talent for the intricate beadwork that decorated Apache clothing and accessories. Nahastzan had taken particular interest in teaching her this skill. "Your fingers good for small work," the older woman had told her approvingly. "Make beautiful things." The beadwork had become Sarah's way of contributing something unique to the tribe. While other women were better at traditional tasks like cooking and hide preparation, Sarah's patterns and color combinations were distinctly her own, influenced by designs she remembered from her life back in Missouri, but adapted to Apache materials and traditions. Ayanna had been a constant presence throughout these months, checking on their welfare and gradually becoming something more than just their protector. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits, enjoying their conversations about Apache customs, the changing seasons, and occasionally, carefully, about the world beyond the camp. "You think about old life sometimes," he said one evening as they sat together near Desba's fire. It wasn't a question. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but less than I expected. It feels like that happened to a different person." Maybe it did. Maybe Sarah from Wagon Train died and new Sarah born here with Apache. Sarah considered this. There was truth in what he said. The frightened girl who had pointed a rifle at Apache warriors seemed like a stranger to her now. The woman she had become was stronger, more adaptable, more aware of the world around her. "Do you ever think about your sister?" she asked quietly. Ayanna's expression darkened. "Every day. Wonder if she's still alive, if she remember Apache ways, if soldiers treat her with honor, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry. I know it's not the same, but losing family, it changes everything." "Yes, but maybe spirits give back what they take away, just in different form." He looked at her meaningfully. "Maybe you and Boy are gift to replace what was lost." Sarah felt her cheeks warm despite the cold air. Over the months, she had become increasingly aware that Ayanna's interest in her well-being went beyond mere protection of prisoners. There were signs she had learned to recognize. The way he always made sure she had enough food, his patient answers to her questions about Apache customs, the small gifts he occasionally left outside Desba's dwelling. But there were complications to any deeper relationship. She was still technically a captive, dependent on the tribe's goodwill for survival, and she was white, which some members of the tribe still viewed with suspicion despite the council's acceptance. The issue came to a head in early spring, when scouts reported that white soldiers were in the area, asking questions about missing settlers from the wagon train attack. The news sent ripples of tension through the camp as people debated what this meant for their safety. "They looking for survivors," Nalnish told the gathered warriors. "Maybe someone saw Apache take white woman and boy. Tell soldiers where to find us." Sarah felt the weight of suspicious glances from some tribal members. Her presence in the camp, which had been accepted during the quiet winter months, suddenly seemed dangerous again. That night, Ayanna came to speak with her privately. "Council meet tomorrow. They decide what to do about soldier problem." "They're going to turn us over to them, aren't they?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would complicate everything. "Some think this is wisest choice. Make peace with soldiers, show Apache not holding white prisoners against their will. And what do you think?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that burned between them. "I think choice should be yours. You've been with us 6 moons now. You learned our ways, helped our people. You earned right to choose your own path. But if I choose to stay, it could bring trouble to the tribe? Yes. Soldiers might attack camp looking for you. Other tribes might think we weak if we give up what we captured in fair battle." No easy answer. Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. If she returned to white civilization, she would have to explain what had happened to the wagon train, face questions about her time with the Apache, and somehow rebuild a life that no longer felt like it belonged to her. Tommy would have to readjust again, leaving behind the friends and skills he had gained here. But if she stayed, she would be putting innocent people at risk. The Apache had shown her kindness and protection when they could have simply killed her. She couldn't repay that by bringing danger to their families. "There's another choice," Ayanna said quietly. "Ancient Apache laws say if white women choose Apache husband, she become fully Apache. Soldiers cannot claim her then. She belonged to tribe completely. Sarah's breath caught. She had wondered if this possibility might arise, but hearing it stated so directly made her heart race. Are you asking me to marry you? I ask nothing. Only tell you what choices exist. Decision must come from your heart, not from fear or gratitude. That night, Sarah lay awake long after Tommy had fallen asleep, wrestling with the most important decision of her life. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, sheltered, dependent, living according to other people's expectations. Then she thought about the woman she had become, capable, strong, valued for her skills and contributions. She thought about Ayanna, whose quiet strength and honor had impressed her more with each passing day. She thought about Desba, who had come to treat her like a beloved daughter. She thought about the children Tommy played with, and the women who had taught her their crafts and the men who nodded respectfully when she passed. Most of all, she thought about belonging. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, the council gathered again to discuss the soldier problem. Sarah asked to address them before they made their decision. I know my presence here creates difficulties, she began, with Ayanna translating her words. I don't want to bring harm to people who have shown me nothing but kindness. So I want to make my choice clear. She looked around the circle at the faces that had become familiar and dear to her. I choose to stay, not as a prisoner or a guest, but as a member of this tribe. If Ayanna will have me as his wife, and if the council will accept me as Apache, then this is where I belong. The announcement caused a stir among the council members. Several spoke at once, some in approval, others with concern. The elderly leader raised his hand for silence and asked Ayanna a direct question. He asked if this is what I want also. Ayanna translated. I tell him yes if you're sure this is your true choice. It is, Sarah said firmly. I've never been more sure of anything. The debate that followed was lengthy and sometimes heated. Sarah understood enough Apache by now to know that some council members worried about the precedent this would set, while others argued that accepting her completely might actually improve relations with white settlers. Finally, Nahasdzan stood to speak. Her words were passionate and carried obvious conviction. When she finished, several other women nodded in agreement. She say you proved yourself through hard winter. You work like Apache woman. Learn our ways with respect. Teach us useful things in return. She say spirit sent you to replace what soldiers took from us. If Ayanna want you as wife and you want Apache life, then council should make it so. The vote, when it came, was closer than Sarah had hoped, but clear enough. The council would accept her marriage to Ayanna and grant her full membership in the tribe. Any soldiers who came looking for white captives would be told that no such prisoners existed in the camp. That evening, as the tribe prepared for the wedding ceremony that would take place at the next full moon, Sarah sat with Tommy and explained what was happening. Are you happy here? She asked him. Tommy nodded without hesitation. This is home now. The other place. I can barely remember it anymore. You understand that if we do this, we can never go back? We'll be Apache for the rest of our lives. Good, Tommy said simply. I like being Apache, and I like Ayanna. He'll be a good brother for us. As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded their valley, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as white soldiers searched the area, and there would always be the complex task of living between two worlds. But tonight, surrounded by the people who had become her family, she knew she had found her true home. The wedding ceremony took place under a full moon that bathed the entire valley in silver light. Sarah wore a dress that the women of the tribe had created especially for her, made from the finest deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her journey from white captive to Apache bride. Her long brown hair had been braided with traditional ornaments, and her hands were painted with sacred symbols. Ayanna stood beside her dressed in his finest regalia, his chest painted with symbols of protection and strength. The entire tribe had gathered in a circle around them, their faces warm with approval and celebration. Even those who had initially opposed her acceptance into the tribe seemed genuinely happy for the couple. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. There were no written vows or formal prayers, but instead a series of ancient rituals that bound her not just to Ayanna, but to the entire Apache community. She and Ayanna shared food from the same bowl, symbolizing their commitment to provide for each other. They exchanged gifts that represented their individual skills and contributions to the partnership. Most memorably, they walked together through a smoking fire made from sacred plants, emerging on the other side symbolically purified and united. When the formal ceremony ended, the celebration continued long into the night with dancing, storytelling, and feasting. Sarah found herself swept up in the joy of the occasion, dancing traditional Apache dances she had learned over the winter months and laughing with the women who had become her sisters. Tommy seemed especially delighted by the festivities. He had grown several inches over the winter, and his skin had darkened from constant exposure to the sun. Dressed in Apache clothing and speaking the language fluently, he was virtually indistinguishable from the other boys his age. When people asked him about his white origins, he would shrug and say that he had always been Apache, that his previous life was just a dream he had once had. "Boy forget more each day," Desba observed, watching Tommy compete with the other children in traditional games. "Maybe this is best. White world bring only pain for Apache children." Sarah understood what she meant. There were stories in the tribe about Apache children taken by white soldiers, forced into boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native language or practice their customs. Some eventually returned to the tribe, but they were often broken by the experience, caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. As the celebration wound down in the early hours of morning, Sarah and Ayanna walked together to the dwelling that would now be their home. It was larger than Desba's place, with space for a growing family and storage for Ayanna's weapons and hunting equipment. The women of the tribe had filled it with useful gifts: cooking pots, sleeping furs, tools for various tasks, and beautiful decorative items. "No regrets?" Ayanna asked as they stood in the doorway of their new life together. "None," Sarah replied honestly. "This feels right in a way nothing ever has before." 3 days after the wedding, the soldiers arrived. Sarah was gathering firewood with several other women when the scouts came racing back to camp with news that a patrol of cavalry soldiers was approaching from the east. The women immediately began implementing the plan the council had developed for this situation. By the time the soldiers rode into the valley, the camp looked perfectly normal. Children played their usual games, women worked at their daily tasks, and men sat in groups maintaining their weapons and equipment. Sarah was seated in the shade outside her dwelling, working on a piece of beadwork, her face and hands darkened with plant dyes and her hair braided in the complex style favored by married Apache women. The cavalry patrol consisted of about 20 men led by a young lieutenant who looked barely older than Sarah herself. He rode directly to the center of the camp and called out in heavily accented Apache for the tribal leaders to come forward. The elderly council leader approached slowly, accompanied by Ayanna and several other senior warriors. The conversation that followed was conducted in a mixture of Apache and broken English, with both sides being carefully polite but obviously wary. "We're looking for 2 white captives," the lieutenant announced. "A young woman and a boy taken from a wagon train attack last fall. We have reports they might be held in this area." The council leader spoke in Apache to Ayanna, who translated. "He says no white prisoners in this camp. Soldiers can look if they want, but they find only Apache people living Apache way." Sarah forced herself to continue working on her beadwork, though her hands were trembling slightly. From the corner of her eye, she could see the lieutenant scanning the camp, his gaze passing over her without pause. To him, she was just another Apache woman going about her daily tasks. The soldiers did conduct a search, moving through the camp and peering into dwellings. Several of them stopped to examine children and young women more closely, but none showed any recognition when they looked at Sarah or Tommy. The plant dyes, traditional clothing, and months of outdoor living had transformed them completely. When the search was finished, the lieutenant addressed the council again. "If you do encounter any white captives, it would be in your best interest to turn them over to the proper authorities. The army takes a dim view of tribes that harbor stolen civilians." The council leader's response was dignified but firm. "Apache people live in peace when possible. We take no prisoners now, hold no white people against their will. If soldiers find different, they show us proof." After the patrol left, the camp remained tense for several hours. Everyone understood that this might not be the end of military interest in their activities. Other patrols might come, or the soldiers might decide to maintain surveillance of the area. That evening, as the tribe gathered around the fires for their evening meal, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. 9 months ago, She had been a frightened white woman facing capture by Apache raiders. Now she was a married Apache woman whose former identity was so thoroughly buried that white soldiers could look directly at her and see only what she had chosen to become. "You did well today," Ayanna told her quietly. "Even I forget sometimes that you were ever anything but Apache." "Sometimes I forget too," Sarah admitted. "When I try to remember Missouri, it's like thinking about someone else's life." Tommy approached their fire, carrying a bowl of the evening stew. He had been playing with the other boys during the soldiers' visit and seemed completely unaffected by the tension. "Grandmother says the white soldiers looked lost," he reported cheerfully. "She thinks they never find their way back to where they came from." Sarah and Ayanna exchanged amused glances. Tommy's transformation was so complete that he genuinely saw white soldiers as foreign intruders rather than representatives of his former people. As summer progressed, life in the camp returned to its normal rhythms. The soldiers did not return, and gradually the tribe's vigilance relaxed. Sarah settled into her role as Ayanna's wife, contributing her skills to the community and learning new ones from the other women. By autumn, she was pregnant with her first child. The news was greeted with joy throughout the camp, as it represented final proof of her complete acceptance into the tribe. A child born to Apache parents, regardless of their origins, would be fully Apache from birth. Standing outside her dwelling one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened young woman who had cried, "Don't let them take me," seemed like a character from a story she had once heard. The Apache arrows that had answered that cry had indeed taken her, but they had given her a new life, a new identity, and a new home in return. Tommy, now nearly 10 and fully grown into his Apache identity, came running up to tell her about his success in the day's hunting practice. Ayanna emerged from their dwelling, his face lighting up at the sight of his growing family. "She's mine," Sarah thought, remembering Ayanna's words from that first day. But the truth was more complex than that. She belonged to him, but she also belonged to the tribe, to the land, to the life she had chosen to embrace. And in return, all of these things belonged to her in ways she was still discovering. As the stars emerged one by one in the clear desert sky, Sarah Mitchell, now known to her people as Chilnabiho, the woman who came from the white world, felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found her true place in the world. The arrows had indeed answered her cry, but they had given her far more than they had taken away.